Ladies and gentlemen, presenting the Professor Greg Dooley and the pundit Steve Clark. Men, take the mic.
That's right, it's the Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clark. We are presented by Nick Hopwood, a certified financial planner. He's the founder and president of Peak Wealth Management. Retire with confidence. Thank you for joining us again this week. This is episode 4, Greg, and want to remind people if the first time you stumbled upon this and you like what you hear, you could definitely subscribe to the Professor and the Pundit podcast. You can rate, review, share it with your friends, and you can get it anywhere a podcast can be found.
Yeah, and we've got some feedback. We actually got a question on Spotify for a listener named, codename Swamp Pockets is his name. So Thank you for the comment. And I did want to follow up because he said, hey guys, love the show. You said you don't think, this was me, that Michigan will extend its Nike/Jordan contract. And I want to say that was episode 1 or 2. And he added, are people not happy with the uniforms? And let me clarify. Michigan can extend the existing Nike-Jordan contract in 2027. I didn't mean to say that they won't. I meant to say they have the right to. In other words, under the same terms of the contract, as I understand it, they can extend the same payments, the same process, the same contract for 4 more years. It doesn't mean they're not happy with it. And I didn't mean to say they're not happy with Nike and Jordan, which, by the way, are 2 separate things, because the Jordan brand, I believe, is exclusive to the football program and the basketball programs, whereas Nike outfits the rest of the teams. No, I have heard nothing that they're not happy with Nike. In fact, you added, Swamp Pockets added as well, I like it a lot more than the Adidas era. And I think that is the sentiment of the vast majority of Michigan fans. What do you think about that, Steve?
I agree. If you think about it down at the end where the basketball jerseys were getting a different look all the time, I think one of the last incarnations that Adidas came out for the basketball jersey looked like these tire prints that went over their abdomen. And it looks like, they had gotten run over. And, Wisconsin was Adidas for a while too, and they kind of had a similar thread. I think more people also sustain what you're wearing with success. So when Michigan was winning a lot, they were wearing Nike. And under Rich Rod, they were under Adidas. And the two have nothing to do with one another.
Absolutely true.
There's this causal relationship that these two things were happening at the same time. Therefore, I don't like Adidas. Let's go back to Nike when we won, even though it really didn't mean anything.
No, and I totally agree. By the way, there were problems with fit and the quality of some of the jerseys, according to players and things like that, that I think were not so public, but I've heard as much with the Adidas stuff. But that's funny because right now, one of the kind of buzzworthy movies that are out there is Air, that is about Sonny Vaccaro, and it's Matt Damon and Ben Affleck, their movie that's available on Prime Video, and it's really good, and it's basically about Sonny Vaccaro and Nike wooing Michael Jordan and creating the Air Jordan brand and all that stuff. And speaking of reputation, well, when the movie takes place, the NBA and what was cool were 2 things, Converse and Adidas. Those were the brands.
That's right. Magic Johnson was Converse, wasn't he?
Larry Bird, Julius Erving, all Converse.
The big 3.
That was the pitch to Jordan, was you be the 4. And the problem was, well, I don't want to be the 4. I want to be Jordan.
1.
And I think I'm special. And Adidas was cool. And they kind of keep hitting on this because of the hip-hop culture that was kind of coming up right then and the sweatsuits. And it was right around the time when Run DMC came out with My Adidas. It was right before that, but they heard it was coming out. And Adidas was the brand. And it's funny how these things shift.
And the way marketing is done. So I think of that Run DMC video with Steven Tyler and Aerosmith, the blending together. It's a cultural deal, right? So you see them on
this way.
Yes,
yeah.
And you see it on the documentaries, and people wax nostalgic about how it brought hip hop and rock together. The one continuous clip that you always see is this big footprint that shows up on stage like they're wearing moon boots, Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. And you remember the white shoe with the red Adidas stripes. And if that's one of the few things that I remember about that video, then it shows that Adidas was pretty smart.
Yeah. One of the reasons I'm watching it is, Steve, believe it or not, with my research in the NIL class, I talked to a professor who said, hey, you should talk to Sonny Vaccaro. And I'm like, that would be great. What do you mean? He gave me his contact info. He goes, no, he's in California. He loves to talk to people. So I emailed him recently, and we are going to talk. We have a meeting coming up.
It's amazing.
Yeah, and I am so excited. I watched Soul Man, which is the ESPN 30 for 30, again, all about Sonny Vaccaro, and it goes beyond the Jordan relationships and all that and all the other stuff with Kobe Bryant. And anyway, the reason the guy suggested I talk to him was he was the guy that really was involved with Ed O'Bannon and Ed O'Bannon's lawsuit against EA Sports. That really was one of those hits against the NCAA in the legal sense that really led to where we are today with NIL. So hope to have more about that awesome conversation coming up.
It's really interesting because I know that Converse has kind of got a nostalgic comeback look, but there's a lot of people just wearing Converse shoes as their everyday go-to relaxing shoes. And then it also made me think while you're talking about it, it wasn't too long ago, maybe it was like 5 years ago, where Under Armour was trying to take over the world and all of the sponsorships, and had Steph Curry as one of their main marketing brands, and they were sponsoring universities, and now I'm looking at Under Armour stock right now, like they're getting out of the athletics business, and this used to be a $30 plus stock that is now right down to $7.
Yeah, again, we should have Nick on, but we talked about Notre Dame, and they're not even in the game. They know they're out of bidding on Notre Dame's apparel contract, so they're not going to renew. Yeah, Notre Dame, we must protect this house and all that. I mean, it was cool, man.
Yeah.
It was almost like this is some kind of specialized athletic gear for football teams, right? It had that buzz.
It was the new in vogue advertising.
Yeah.
As is, the Jordan brand for Nike.
By the way, do you know who owns Converse now?
No.
Nike bought them.
I did not know that.
They bought the dying brand, and it suddenly is cool again. So I think we talked about the Appalachian State and Oregon game in the context of how big the next game was, that Notre Dame game.
Yes.
Phil Knight, the owner and founder of Nike, he was at that Oregon game, and I know this because I took a picture of him coming up to the press box or wherever he was sitting. And I remember, first of all, he's kind of a strange-looking fellow, no offense. I heard that he hung out at some of the Ann Arbor bars beforehand, so there was rumors that Phil Knight was in town. And he had this giant, notebook with him. I assume all the plays and the coach's notes and all that stuff, walking up to wherever he was going up in the press box area. So Phil Knight, there you go. By the way, he's portrayed by Ben Affleck in this Air movie, and they get into some of his kind of odd behavior a little bit. It was pretty good. Pretty well done. So I'm looking forward to talking to Sonny Vaccaro. I can't even believe I'm saying that. So that'll be very cool. Now, I did have a really cool set of guests this past week. I had Chris Bryant, who is the director of player development, come in. I had a woman named Nadine DeBaja, who's an attorney and an agent who works with Valiant Management, Jared Wengler's firm, as well as Danielle Davison, who works for the Michigan Athletic Department. She's the kind of one who handles and supports the athletes in all their NIL deals, as much as Michigan can be involved with that. So it was a really great week.
How big is the NIL player development staff at Michigan?
So I don't know how big the player development staff is, but the NIL team within the athletic department is Danielle right now.
Just Danielle?
It's, in fact, I don't think this is any kind of breaking news, but her title or her role is compliance, and she handles NIL. So she almost has two jobs.
She's split.
Yeah, now there's obviously an overlap. There could be an overlap there with compliance, but
makes you wonder if that's going to change in the future.
Well, so one of the things...
She's going to be running a major department with its own building in about 5 years.
Well, so Danielle actually came from Clemson, which I think we've talked about. They have this thing that Dabo nicknamed the Cab, which is a 2-story, basically multimedia marketing studio with lighting and video editing, and that supports players for building their brand, and they have staff around that and other things. And so people look at things like that at Michigan and go, well, where's ours? So, but she's amazing. I actually heard that despite a lot of people's belief that we don't quite have the focus on NIL, Danielle said that we're one of the highest volume as far as deals that are coming through this app. Influencer is the name of the app. And that we have some of the highest volume amongst peers, amongst colleges. Now, I am going down to this event in Atlanta called the NIL Summit. It's actually, the main sponsor is Influencer. And I hope to learn a little more about what's going on in other schools and see what kind of stats they have and what kind of deals are going on, and also some of the products that are out there. So that should be cool.
This NIL event, is this going to be like at some, ballroom at a hotel, or is this at some guy's mansion who's, power people, who is who, everyone's trying to get 2 minutes with so-and-so?
Right. I don't think it's at Bruce Wayne's Manor, but Wayne Manor, rather. I think it's at a typical convention. Like, I used to go to IT conventions in ballrooms and carved out rooms with sessions and things like that, and lunch in one place. But it should be fun. No, but I'll bring back a lot on that. I also mentioned Chris Bryant came in, and we're off the record when these guests come in. So, I can obviously talk about who they are and high level what they do in his role working with the players and agents in the activity around NIL. And I knew that he existed, and I've heard stories, and I know what agents are. But I guess I didn't realize how big of a factor they are.
One of the things.
And by the way, let me clarify in the conversation, I don't mean in recruiting, okay? Because that's not something that goes on. But when, like, big players, they have representation now, as they probably should. They shouldn't just be off signing contracts on their own, but it's their representation.
You know what I would almost love to do for your class? Remember Bob Lee's Outside the Lines?
Yes.
On ESPN? I'm sure Sonny Vaccaro was a guest, and when he wasn't a guest, just part of the subject matter of what was going on about do's and don'ts and how things are changing. I think if I put up some sort of montage of the best of Bob Lee's Outside the Lines, presenting the dangers and changes and the swift currents that are going on, I think it would be laughable to play that back now, in front of your students, because they're learning a lot from you of what things are currently at. And the things that they probably were like sweating bullets over about what could happen is like an afterthought in this moment of the new NIL world.
Even in the 30 for 30 on Sonny Vaccaro, they have coaches come on and they're like, well, no, you can't pay players. Coaches are saying this. Like no coach is saying that today. Okay. Like Jim Boeheim, the value of an education, and they're pontificating about this, by the way, while the coaches were being paid handsomely by the shoe companies at the time. That's how it started. So to that point, Calipari's on there, and he's kind of the one going, well, maybe they should pay him a little bit. And I can't stand this guy, but I found myself like, yeah, he kind of had it right with this. He was the only one. They had Larry Brown on there.
Sure.
Yeah, and they're all going, but that's how everybody felt,
Yesterday's rogue guy, a disruptor who's going to shake the earth and everybody vilified for it, then becomes like one of the forefathers. If it changes, if the attitude changes in their direction, the vilified person becomes the forefather, the godfather, whatever
Steve,
of this movement.
It's happening. And by the way, Sonny's very good at branding and marketing. I think he's trying to position himself as that. And he has a point. But back then, he was the shady guy with the bag of shoes. Yeah, that's who he was. So, but now he's the guy who signed Jordan, and broke all the rules and had relationships with high school players, which everyone kind of gets now. Half discovered LeBron, not really, but saw the potential. Claims kind of he discovered Kobe Bryant or knew, was on him earlier than everybody else. But back then, kind of perceived as a sleazebag, or
absolutely he was
mobster. Like, so one guy goes, yeah, he kissed me on both cheeks. I thought he seemed like a mobster or something to me. He worked in the gray areas and the shadows, Yeah. Well, it's funny because I remember when I track on Invictors all the uniform changes over the years. And there was a year when pretty early on in the 80s went all Nike. And so the team exclusively was outfitted because in the 70s, there's pictures of a guy wearing Pony, a guy wearing Adidas, a guy wearing whatever. They just wore different shoes. Finally, they're all kind of uniform wearing Nike. I'm curious, and I think that might have predated Vaccaro's time at Nike, but I wonder if he had any interaction with Michigan football. I know he had interactions with the Fab Five. Now, he was let go at Nike in 1991, but he ran all the ABCD, like high school basketball camps and the Dapper Dan things and all that. So I know he knows those guys. In fact, you can see high school Jawan, high school Jimmy King show up in this ESPN 30 for 30 as high school players. So I'm going to ask him about Jimmy and Jawan. To my point about the agents for active athletes, they're probably needed. They're required in many cases. They should get support, but they're part of the conversation. So when you get somebody like Chris Bryant, whose responsibility is player development, which is really off the field stuff, right? Their lives, their coachability, the culture, right? And that relationship. Well, part of that relationship now is this business relationship with the players outside of the team and how they're managing their brand. And agents matter and contracts matter. And yes, it's definitely probably something. That's why that's a role in the NFL, is because that's something that is absolutely a factor on NFL rosters.
Here is the sea change that has not gone on in America in the last 40 years. Sonny Vaccaro, or the subject of Sonny Vaccaro, would be on one of these documentary shows, and they would have an actor portraying him, and they would have some guy, a silhouette of some guy who doesn't want to be identified, because they turn the lighting down, they morph his voice into something else that's not really his,
right.
And say, Sonny Vaccaro approached me in the office. And now, 40 years later, you basically could live stream your meeting with somebody else talking about the exact same things.
Absolutely. And again, public perception and all that stuff about fairness and what a joke the NCAA is, it's shifted completely. And can I say, so I've caught myself too, like one criticism of academics, right, is it's all textbook knowledge. It doesn't really apply in the real world. And I have been busted on being that academic a couple times. So here's an example. This Michigan state law, I'm teaching my students about Michigan state law and NIL, which was written like 2 weeks ago, right?
Bueller.
Yeah.
Bueller.
Well, and of course, it's a horribly boring subject, and I'm trying to make it fun. But I'm like, yeah, so these guys come in, and we're talking about agents, and I'm like, well, the state law stipulates that all agents must be registered within the state of Michigan. Okay, that's on the statute. And so I got some questions. We had a lawyer in there, and we have Danielle, who's, by the way, also a trained lawyer. Oh, really, Mr. Professor? Where do you go to be a licensed agent these days in the state of Michigan? I'm not sure. Go try to find that. And by the way, we have players from all over the country with representation that could be anyone, again, from a professional representation firm like CAA, or it could be anybody. And I'm sure they're registered as where they're supposed to be or whatever. So we're not going to talk to them, and we're going to look up in some database that doesn't exist. It's just that practicality of the real world, and I've been hit with it a few times. Like, oh, but I researched this and read it. Yeah, so I've been nailed with that, and I have to chuckle because I kind of, coming into the University of Michigan, I kind of fancied myself the guy with real-world expertise, and now I'm suddenly becoming the guy who's reading out of off a law that a state legislature probably copied from another state because it sounded good,
You remember Norby Waters and Lloyd Bloom? Remember those names? This is over 30 years ago, but I was just kind of looking up the names to see what do these guys actually do, because I remember it was a big topic of conversation. And who is Norby Waters? And you talk about people associated with the Buffalino crime family. Geez. You remember Bo's book with Mitch Albom?
Yes.
There was a chapter that's called "Get Those Agents Off My Campus."
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's completely different now, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I thought about that. Right, that was a big deal for Bo. I remember that was one of his cornerstones, is get these guys out of here.
So, Greg, I got a 1989, March 15th, Los Angeles Times. I'm just reading the opening paragraph. A jailed member of a New York organized crime family said he helped finance a sports agent business started by Norby Walters and Lloyd Bloom, and used his mob connections to persuade entertainers to do business with Walters.
Oh, can you imagine all the tea drinking social elites disgusted? All of us disgusted by the behavior.
I was one of them, and I was drinking
I know.
Sprite.
Yeah, I was too. We all were, man. Boy, it's funny. I was. That's what. So even when Jimmy King was on campus and I was here, when they protested Nike and they wore the blank warm-ups, I remember. I was like, oh, those guys. They're getting a scholarship. They're getting free cottage and pizza.
Wait a minute. I thought Chris Webber couldn't pay for a pizza.
Well, then there was that. I don't know, man. I just thought, I remember at the time, like, yeah, but I was like Fonzie. I was Jimmy. I was I was wrong.
This is The Professor and the Pundit with Greg Dooley and Steve Clark. We're presented by Nick Hopwood, a certified financial planner, founder, and president of Peak Wealth Management. Retire with confidence. It's halftime, so Nick now joins us. And Nick, in a previous week, we talked about fixed income. And well before the pandemic, I was keeping a lot of cash on hand for comfort reasons, but I wondered how I could do better. And just recently, I discovered a strategy called step laddering.
Well, it's a very popular strategy. It allows you to have more liquidity than locking all the money up for 12 months. You have a new CD coming due every 3 months. Right? So there's your liquidity factor. It also allows you to reinvest for new 12-month CDs, and the yield curve shifts. So you could be renewing that CD at a better rate than before, or at a worse rate than before. And that's the uncertainty, but that's why we divide it up into fourths. So you said pre-pandemic, Steve, you were doing these quarterly ladders. Rates were anchored at 0 back then, if you recall. So the CDs were a better rate than a money market. Money markets were paying nothing. But what we have now in today's market in May 2023 is a near 5% money market, full liquidity. So you might say, I don't need any CDs, right? I can make 5% and have full liquidity. And oftentimes people will choose that money market today for that reason. But if you're thinking ahead and you think, well, what if there's a recession and the Fed starts cutting aggressively soon? And a lot of people are calling for the Fed to cut this year or early next year. Well, your money market rates will be much lower then. So you could lock in those rates with a CD now. So a 12-month CD, 5% or maybe 5.1, something like this. You know that you have the certainty that you'll have that rate for the entire period.
And Nick, if people want to learn more, how do they get a hold of you?
You can schedule an appointment with us at peakwm.com. or give us a call at 734-681-7575.
And one more time, Nick, with that phone number.
734-681-7575.
Thanks, Nick. This is a great partnership, brother. And again, really, if you want to support this show, the number one way, other than subscribing, is to, if you are someone who might use the services, ping Nick, get a hold of him, and just have a conversation. So thank you, Nick. And speaking of money, and we've talked about this, Steve, but the Big Ten TV contract, right now in the current year budget, tickets plus required donations to buy those tickets is about $90 million, or roughly half of Michigan's athletic budget, okay? When the TV money kicks in, it's going to be at least that, and suddenly become, obviously a huge factor in our budget. And if you look at Michigan, we have the biggest stadium. We probably make the most money off of home games than anybody. So obviously this is a big factor. But there was a problem, apparently, with the TV contract. So apparently Kevin Warren didn't quite happen the way it was reported, that the deal was finalized, the deal was clean, and Tony Petitti, the new Big Ten commissioner, had to clean up some of the mess. I don't know if we need to get in all the details, Steve.
Not only did Kevin Warren and his team not dot their I's and cross their T's, I think they used a thesaurus instead of a dictionary when it came to codification. Well,
what do you see?
One thing is they allowed NBC to have rights to the Big Ten championship game in football when they don't.
Right.
It's Fox's game.
Right.
I knew this was Fox's game. I never thought for a moment that it could be delved out to somebody else, that Fox has the right of first refusal to all of this. And of course they're going to keep it. I'm just stunned at some of these things that have come up that suggested that nobody knew. The one thing about not playing games in November, it's always been sort of pushed back. It was always October being the latest, and then there was a shift to the first Saturday in November actually did have a night game. And Ira and Sam were telling me that they're allowing for extenuating circumstances, but in general, November, they do not have night games. Well, NBC claims they never knew that. And
it's just bizarre.
It is bizarre that, one, that wouldn't be put out, but at the same time, and I can't remember what it was. Maybe you can help me. Maybe one of our listeners will help me. But recently, NBC was doing like a one-off Big Ten thing, and I can't remember what it was. Maybe it was a bowl game that they had. But the broadcasters that were on for NBC clearly showed that they did not have a clue about basic fundamental Big Ten knowledge. And I could blame it strictly on the broadcaster, but it wasn't that. It was like, this network doesn't understand what common people in the Big Ten have ingrained in their heads about how things work or how things go. They were just putting out either wrong information, but just take my word for it. I just got the clear indication as how could NBC be that ignorant of doing something with the Big Ten?
I have no clue. And even Ward chimed in like about the night game thing and being left in the dark. They talked about summaries of contracts being distributed, but not the fine detail. And so, and the other point was, I saw in the ESPN story, was it Pete Thamel? Who wrote the ESPN story? Was that who it was? ESPN story?
Yes.
Yeah, a line in it says, the league has brought in an outside search firm, Korn Ferry, to determine whether Warren's work, Kevin Warren, with the television deal should bring him a bonus. So apparently he had a clause in his contract to, if he closed the deal, to get a bonus. And hey, FYI, you don't bring in paid consultants or experts to determine whether to make a fair arbitrated decision. You bring in experts to basically say, no, he's not getting the money. And this is why they brought in these guys to basically defend their argument that, and have a third party say, yeah, we don't have to pay him. And they shouldn't have to pay this guy on the way out. It's funny because I had some respect for him, how we recovered out of COVID and some of the pivots that the Big Ten made. I think it was bungled at first and changed his mind. And then you had the momentum of the USC and UCLA adding to the Big Ten, which I think most people said was a good thing. And then the TV contract. And now on the way out, the guy disappeared. And we're in this situation. It's wild.
It started with COVID. It was a bad time for anybody to become the commissioner of anything.
True.
At that particular point. But if you remember, Ohio State football parents were marching outside with pickets, outside the Big Ten commissioner's office. And it seemed like it was being handled poorly. But you're right. They pivoted. And when it comes to USC and UCLA, most common people that I would talk to just can't stand it. They don't like it at all.
Really? The UCLA
yes,
and USC? Really?
Just hate it. Well, the reasoning is they don't belong there. The Big Ten doesn't belong out in Pac-12 country. It is sort of a rival conference. Their best are coming over here. Why are we going over there? Why are we doing 3-day plane trips? I get it. The common person is saying that. But it's eat or be eaten. And I'm glad that the Big Ten decided to choose to eat instead of being absorbed by somebody else.
Yeah, maybe for me and for the people I hear, maybe they're thinking more like that because I'm kind of excited about playing USC. And I look at it that way. And yeah, there is going to be a burden on the student athletes, and it's kind of a weird fit. But UCLA, Rose Bowl, it's a very, very tightly fit. So
we're going to have a 12-team playoff system, but initially for a number of years it's been 4, and there's been 5 Power 5 conferences. You feel like some chair is leaving, and there's been predictions about who is it going to be. Is it the Pac-12? Is it the Big 12? Is it the ACC? The two conferences are saying seem to be on solid ground as the Big Ten and the SEC. And so you have to thank Kevin Warren and Jim Delaney for putting that conference in that position as opposed to being the other 3. Last week, Greg, we talked about the ACC, in which they kind of made a subtext of a move started by the Florida State athletic director who says, this situation isn't good enough. I can't be undercut by $30 million by the SEC and the Big Ten. We need an unequitable share distribution, and Florida State deserves more.
Yeah.
This week, there has been a change, and the ACC didn't say, Florida State, of course you're right, here are the extra millions that you think you're owed. They did decide, though, that they are going to have an inequitable relationship. It isn't going to be straight revenue sharing anymore. It doesn't necessarily benefit Florida State, but benefits any school that is successful. If you can get an NCAA tournament run together, if you can make the 12-team college football playoff that starts next year in 2024, 2025, you get extra money, which means some of the schools that aren't sniffing tournament runs or a college football playoff are going to find they're going to be receiving less money than what they normally get. But people don't talk about that. They talk about the successful schools potentially getting more.
In other words, it's not going in the pot, so you're good if you have a down year. You're getting your share. You're not actually of that money,
right?
Which might be significant, especially in the case of the playoff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So a lot of money could be changing hands, but now it's going to be a certain percentage. Florida State may be up on a bit of an upswing. Maybe they'll actually get some extra revenue. But it's not just for them. It's for any school that is able to perform both on the football field and in the basketball court. So that's what they could do, but they didn't really get to the heart of the deal that this conference is still bringing in about $30 million less per average than everybody else. So I understand that the ACC contract that goes into 2036 was made as an effort to maximize sustainability in this turbulent world. We should be good. Except the Big Ten and the SEC's contracts came up shortly thereafter that, and they're getting paid exponentially more.
Right.
So, and I think the key thing here, Craig, is timing is everything. You maximize the contract, everything looks great. All of a sudden it looks bad when the Big Ten and the SEC do their contracts. Can it go a full 360? Take a look. ESPN didn't bid on the Big Ten this year. They didn't bid on new scheduling for the NFL networks. The Big 12 and the Pac-12 are struggling to come up with any kind of deal that's close to the Big Ten and the SEC, and it's not necessarily about the quality of teams in the markets. It's literally these networks are finally turning off the valve of money that's coming through. And the media conglomerates in general, like ESPN, Disney, Paramount, Comcast, they're going down, not up. So I wonder if the Big Ten and the SEC have a shorter contract that doesn't go to 236. Are they going to be able to get the same type of money at the contract extension or not? I think it's going to be a big question.
You're right. Look, there could be a point. We just think that the popularity and the desire for the streaming dollars and the TV dollars is going to continue indefinitely. There's a chance that it's not quite the big thing that everybody wants to see in 10 years. Habits have changed. Our kids don't watch TV, Steve. They're staring at their phone. I mean, how often do people watch these games on their phones? I suppose they do.
You look at Reels and TikTok, and to this newer generation coming up, the Gen Zs, this is after millennials, they're getting their entertainment in 60-second doses.
Yeah.
And they'll watch 100 of them, completely different. They don't need storylines or plots anymore.
Yeah, one thing that's been pretty stable is football has been pretty popular throughout, okay? And I expect it to be very popular. But there are other sports that come and go. To your point about this next generation, the UFC has come on really strong and are from nothing to a pretty big factor in sports. Esports, interesting to me as a 50-year-old guy, actually more entertaining than I thought when I've watched them, and much more appealing to the younger generation. We'll have to see. Women's sports, obviously basketball picking up, so we'll see where this stuff goes. I think there are opportunities, but is it all in conference-based team sports 10, 20 years from now? Here's the other thing I'll just throw in is colleges. There's a lot of talk now about the value of college education. I suppose that was going on for a while, but brick and mortar colleges, okay, maybe in the next generation, people are still congregating physically in colleges and going to college and filling up stadiums. But I see a day where that changes. It's there somewhere. It's not indefinitely that people are going to fill up buildings and colleges and actually attend for 4 years. The day is coming. And what is the impact on that, on student athletes?
Well,
are we going to have just teams here that play? You
can't even get many of the students to show up to a football game on time.
Well, that's the generation that's taking over. Oh, and we brought up this whole issue of advertising in Michigan Stadium came up in my class, okay? Because it's always, well, if we just advertised in Michigan Stadium, sir, I could eat tonight, and we could have a marketing studio, or we could have 3 more teams. And the students don't care until you talk about this, that, hey, Michigan Stadium is one of the few stadiums in the country that doesn't have advertising in it anywhere. In fact, it's kind of a policy that we have. They'll go, oh, yeah, I guess we don't have advertising. Why is that? And then Would you care if the net behind the goalpost was sponsored by Allstate? Doesn't everybody do that? We don't do that. They don't notice. They don't care. It's different. And there's just different sentiments and different tastes. And we're going to have to see where that goes.
I think there's a sense of pride about the lack of advertising
Big time.
in the stadium by the older generations.
Absolutely.
And now this generation doesn't seem to care, or they don't notice. I notice when going on a road game.
I do too. But it's not just pride. There's bitterness with some fans at the athletic department about getting nickeled and dimed on seat donations and seat price increases, coupled with bad football seasons where people lost their shirts if they were trying to get rid of their tickets or can't. There's bitterness. There were promises made about how seat licenses would be applied that haven't come to be. So there's that too. And yes, we are fading away. That group is fading away.
Our sphere of influence is starting to end, right?
Yeah.
We're at the tail end of where our age, 50, is making an influence over what goes on.
We should have started this podcast much earlier.
We
Steve.
should have.
What are we doing?
We'd have a corporate contract by now. Hey, before we wrap up, other news that's going on in college football that will relate to Michigan and the Big Ten from multiple sources, including CBS and The Athletic, is that the Big 12 has reached out to Colorado about bringing them back to their conference, along with Utah and the Arizona schools to join them. If the panic button hits, because the Pac-12 does not have a media contract and it doesn't seem like they're close, the Pac-12 would be left with the 2 Oregon schools, the 2 Washington schools, Stanford and Cal.
The Pac-6.
Exactly. To survive the Pac-6 would have to raid the best teams out of the Mountain West.
I would just call it the six-pack.
Yeah, six-pack.
Thank you.
Bad.
Thank you.
It's not bad.
I just made that up.
With a little plastic thingy on
That would
on
be
the front.
sweet.
For them to survive, they'd have to raid the best teams out of the Mountain West or hope they get absorbed by the Big Ten. What people have to realize that the members of the Big Ten, soon to be 16 teams, are getting their biggest bang for their buck right now for each university. And adding teams to that mix could bring you more revenue, but it may reduce the individual school payouts. And what is that number again?
So it's roughly 90 to 100 million should be the new TV money. Plus, you have to budget for, well, how much playoff money are we going to get? I don't know how they're doing that math.
I remember when it was 25.
Yeah, but they have to do that math, right?
Right.
Like okay, we'll probably have an average of 2.5 teams in each playoff and play 3 of the games, and every 3, they got to do that math.
Well, and we have Kevin Warren's accounting, then we don't know exactly what that's going to be. But
somehow it's less, right? And we have to play on every December evening.
Fans may love the expansion, especially when you think about who can get in. You said you like USC and UCLA coming in. They may want it, but hypothetically, if each school is going to get $90 million per year now, and it becomes $75 million because you've added a few schools, I think it's going to be a hard pass by the institutions that are voting. You have Stanford, Cal, and Georgia Tech. They may not move the meter in terms of the on-field competition and what fans are interested in seeing, but they're in San Francisco. They're in Atlanta. That might increase the institutional revenue string from $90 million to something north, maybe, or just keep it the same.
So you're assuming, obviously, that if we add teams and markets, that the TV contract changes. So
we are assuming that because it was open to that.
Yeah, it was open to, it included, if you add the contract. Okay, so there could be a new stream of revenue, rather, but that probably doesn't offset the slicing of this pie into tinier little pieces for the biggest piece, which is just the contract itself. Well, and here's the other thing. So you talked about the ACC teams basically keeping, I know it's not a 1-for-1, but if you make the playoff, you keep the money. That's kind of the way it works. So it's an incentive. If you make the playoff, you get to keep the money. Do you think there's people at Michigan and Ohio State are going, well, wait a minute. I'm sure they've considered that. And we've talked about it a little bit. But the Big Ten's always been about, we're going to share this money. But I do think that there are things come from being Michigan and Ohio State, which is whenever something big comes up with the Big Ten, they're not calling Northwestern, right? They're not calling Purdue. They're not calling the athletic directors of those institutions. They're calling Ohio State and Michigan and running those ideas by them. So influence does come from what you get, but you're literally bringing in more revenue and carrying more of the load on the TV schedule with now the night game that Penn State and Michigan State are going to play in November at Ford Field, by the way, which is interesting in itself. But those are the teams that are really driving that TV contract. So Michigan, Ohio State would absolutely have a right to go. We deserve more. But I get why we're kind of playing ball and being a good corporate citizen.
Well, I'll tell you, Michigan, Ohio State may rule the Big Ten, but Penn State figures they're a part of that too. And they sometimes feel a little disgruntled that they're not part of the trifecta. They feel like sort of like a third wheel at times. This is what Penn State people feel. So you've got these teams that aren't exactly great on the field, but in big markets that could help push that dollar amount up. But on the other hand, you have like a Florida State or a North Carolina Duke combination, which is plenty more interesting on the field. But again, are they in markets that are going to move that money per school dollar amount up? Oregon State and Washington State, Wake Forest, North Carolina State, and even Syracuse out of the ACC. I would be fearful if I were them for their future. You have to wonder where your place is and what's your pecking order in the current conference totem pole. They're the ones that don't have much of a football program and not in a big market.
Yeah, the only thing I'd be shocked at in the next year, even 6 months, is if nothing happens. Or if no team actually makes arrangements, moves, makes plans to move, makes an adjustment, because it's almost inevitable here that something's going to happen, and you just cannot be left. I love you say musical chairs. It's exactly what it is. Musical chairs.
Musical Chairs is running out, and the music is coming up here at the end of our podcast, Greg. So again, thanks everybody for listening, and please remember to subscribe to The Professor and the Pundit. You can rate and review it because we certainly will take your feedback. We may even include some of your questions into the program itself. Share with your friends too. This show is available wherever you find your favorite podcast. I am Steve Clark.
I am Greg Dooley.
But until then, remember, Michigan football are back-to-back Big Ten champs and winners over Ohio State and Michigan State. Go Blue.
Go Blue.